How's it going, everyone? Oliver Gonzalez here. Today we're going to explore now the SCO analysis and static analysis by looking at the code coverage section. This is a topic that is part of the model taught by Steve Kinney, head frontend engineer at Temporal. So shout out to Steve Kinney because over the past 5 months, we were able to actually understand and describe is what is the value proposition not only for this course but for UI developers, especially those who wants to solve maintainability problems to enterprise, to companies. So again, the value propositions from UI developers or UI specialists to enterprise is that not only that you are capable to translate designs into Figma or XD Adobe design from any of these front-end React or front-end libraries components, whether it's React, Angular, Vue, Svelte, you name it. But also is that how are you going to now provide maintainability to this? In other words, is how can we now make this huge, gigantic, large code bases that we inherit that we need to share across diverse teams over a long period of time, and we want to make this sustainable over a long period of time. Now, first we went in through the philosophical aspect and then now into the more practical approach, and that is by understanding is what is the maintainability concepts, at least for the software development, like, hey, can I have the ability to add or change or do a refactor or a migration without the fear of breaking something, all right? So the more confident we have here, the more maintainable will be this kind of UI code bases, particularly the enterprise UI. And then, well, again, according to Steve Kinney, so we went through the pyramid of Maslow pyramid of recognize what is the base things that we need to put in place, and that is the testing systems, build system, and the static analysis. So today we're going to explore now this static analysis, especially by exploring the code coverage, and also that how code coverage actually is something. It won't give you now the details, or it won't give you too much confidence that your code works as it is. It just tells you that how your source is tested. That's completely different things here, right? And even though that a lot of companies use this metric, for example, like 80% code coverage, and a lot of companies are actually now pushing the boundaries to move the needle to that. The reason is that, yes, are you testing the code that actually really matters to the company? And if those tests actually now provide the value that you are looking for, in other words, it's actually follow and guarantee that the user stories are so it's guaranteed that the user story work as expected. So that's a value proposition of writing tests, all right, especially unit tests and component tests, is that, hey, does this behavior that you implement, or is the user story, is this feature actually now satisfy the user story, what the user wants to look? And that is by looking at that is by defining its unit tests and components tests that actually align to that. So because this too actually is something that is way is far from the implementation, at least the Unit testing, even though that they are cheap and fast, and component testing that is focused on the UI elements, the the whole idea of this is if you want to have full confidence of your test, you will end up need to do this E2E test or this full end-to-end tests. Again, this is some tests that are back in a couple years ago. It was quite expensive, but now over the couple years, is something that is quite more affordable for companies. So, for example, we have now Playwright that we can use, but before that into this, we're gonna look at the code coverage, specifically the what is the code coverage, what is the value proposition of this, understand the different tools or the most popular tools out there, such as Istanbul, NGC, and C8, right? And understand now what is the output that it generates to. And also, again, what is the value proposition of this code coverage? As I mentioned before, it tells you is how much of your source is test. If those tests doesn't resemble to the user story, to what the end user expect at the end of the day, then you can ditch all of your tests because they don't give you confidence. Yeah, you can ditch your test. You know, it's like you actually are wasting time. So, with that, all right, the TLDR of all of this is that as we now reach to the code coverage here, which is, see, yeah, if we look at the code coverage and how do we get here, by first understanding is this a spectrum of the testing system. You have now unit testing. We look at unit testing. What are the tools that we can go with, and how can we write our tests by defining the setup, and then the testing logic, and then the assertions, and how can we look at the most common methods to work with our unit tests. So, for example, is the to be equal. What is the difference between them? There's a concept known as referential equality, which is just a fancy name to say, hey, does this two object has the same reference in memory? And also, you look at the deep equality. Is that, hey, these two nested objects actually are equals in values, in key value, right? So to contain the to be instance of, to be throw, to be error, and to expect any, to object contain, expect dot object containing, expect array containing, you know. But the idea here is that at the end of the day, this is what we want, right? Yeah, pretty much at the end of the day, this is what we want. So, on that, we also look at how can we now write our tests to pass now to the build system, all right? How can we create this build system part of the CI/CD process using GitHub Actions, which is allow you to define a work flow where based on the Git events that you defined, you're going to run some jobs or some bash scripts or some GitHub Actions inside of a virtual machine that is provided for us by GitHub, whether it's on a Mac, Linux, Windows. Also, how can we do that? How can we now improve the performance when you want to, for example, set up a build process or a testing, all right? Most likely for build process, when you want to speed up things a little bit, especially if nothing has changed on the package JSON, then all right, you can reuse the existing dependency that was previously built. So then, how can we now look at the another spectrum of the test, which is now component testing, and how in the component testing we have tools like testing libraries, which is a nice wrapper around the front, the front end UI components, whether it's Angular, React, Vue, but in our case with React, we also looked at now how can we wrap is the most common functionality or user interactions that the user does, right? So key up, typing, clicking, right? So we can now detect those or access to those methods once you wrap this into this React components or the UI components. And also we can query these elements inside of our UI. Now, then we looked at the particularly challenge, especially of creating now React applications when you want to isolate your components. And that is some techniques that arouse here, such as, hey, let's going to mock this. Let's going to now mock is the external sources that this component use. I'm not a big fan of that. Or use as a provider or a testing provider wrapping around a component. This is something useful, especially if your component needs to interact with external system. So if your code now interact with, or if you can test, if you can control code that you can control, code that you can, code that you own, you must not mock that. So in other words, when you are writing your testing components in a way that give you is much more confidence about that, that's also the value proposition of test, is, hey, the idea of testing is that we now have enough confidence, so we know that things won't break behind our back, right? Now, in this component testing, it now open up a new world or a new set of questions, which is, hey, how then can we organize is our UI elements or UI component or structure or project in a way that it make it easy for us to test. So here is when we look at the clean, for example, architecture, or the hexagon architecture. This is some topic that we haven't dived deep too much, but again, it's go beyond the scope of today's video. But it's important at least to mention that, right? As well as how when we set up the build tool system, we also, again, just for demo, and just for info purpose, the IT, security and compliance, and how we have different models to handle that. So for example, the castle mode, and now the zero trust policy models, and the architecture around this that want to connect, or that want to close the gap between network connectivity and network access, network security and network connectivity. And this is now an architecture called SASE, Secure Access Service Edge, right? And they have now a bunch of technology or techniques that made this possible. Zero policy is one of them. Secure web access, CASB, the cloud access secure broker, the next generation of firewall, one as a service, and the compliance. It's like, hey, Are you following is the quality management system, uh, which is the ISO 9001, or the information security management system like ISO ISC 27 27 1, the SOC, the System and Organizations Control, and those are more industry specific. So, for example, like PCI DSS, the payment card industry data standard security, or the HIPAA for the health and care, the banks as well have a lot of regulations, and you name it, right? The FedRAMP, which is the federal, the federal FedRAMP, the Federal Risk Authorization Management. Yeah, this is something, the FedRAMP. Yeah, the FedRAMP, the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program. This one, the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program, is that so according to Atlassian, right? All right. Mm-hmm. So according to Atlassian, right, it provides now an standards to evaluate, authorize, and supervise the continuous security of products and services on the cloud. This is part of the subtle stuff that we need to know. Mm-hmm. Interesting. And of course, there's a lot of regulation that you must go. But again, this set of standards that are made by the federal agency, the U.S. federal agency, is just to evaluate, authorize, and monitor goods and service or products and services on the cloud. And I think this is quite interesting, especially and also helpful for customers for things like these financial services that are now allowed as an API, right? APIs as financial service. So Stripe is one of them. Blade, among others, right? But in any case, and then finally, look at this accessibility and code coverage. And accessibility, there's a particular library that help you to check the known common accessibility issue that you might have in your application. It's not a silver bullet, but it can help. And then the code coverage. What is a code coverage? How do we calculate code coverage? It's based on functions, how many times this function has been called, statement, how many times this statement has been executed, branches, how many of these, how many of the branch control structure, whether it is if or switch, has been executed, the condition coverage, how much of the Boolean expression has been tested from true and true and false values, and the line of code, how many of line of source code has been tested, right? So at least understanding this notion of the code coverage and be able to describe that, especially anytime that you need to work for big companies, whether it's on the financial service, so on and so forth. And by looking at this, a work on Sonar, okay, which provides now is a static analysis. In other words, it runs your programs before build. So it check now that, or it do It's like a type checking, right? It's a type checking that evaluates your code before run. And this sonar is follow several good practice and guidelines from the OWASP, okay, Open Web Application Security Project, the CWE, the Common Weakness Enumerations, which is a list of known security vulnerability in software and hardware. The CERT, the computer emergency response team. You can think of this like a SWAP. SWAP. SWAP? No, is SWAP. What? SWAP. What was the? Wow. SWAP. SWAT. God damn. SWAP. Exactly, SWAT. It's pretty much like the SWAT. You know, special tactic force, special weapons and tactics, the SWAT. Yeah, that's right. Well, you can think of the CERT, some sort of this, the computer emergency response team. When something goes wrong, it's like, here we are, U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers. All right, good. So this is sonar, all right. Actually, in the current company I'm working, we are using sonar for that. And sonar is a very powerful tool that is being used by companies like Microsoft and other big tech company, which it makes a lot of sense for companies in the financial service and the financial systems actually use this kind of stuff. So it gives you now some of this recommendation. It's like, hey, for example, in the case of JavaScript, hey, what is the rules that they enforce to have a compliant and secure JavaScript app? Unique rules to find bugs, vulnerability, security, hotspots, and code smell in your JavaScript code. Yep, clean code attributes, and you can find by that. You can say the code smell here, as it is, non-compliant code examples. There's a lot of code smell like that. Yep, a lot of code smell. And also, as you can see here, well, we are about to see how to do that as well, right? Even though that this actually tells you, for example, deprecated React API should not be used in your code base, so you have to now, so it enforces you to do this for maintainability. It's like, hey, don't use now this, update to this. And this is quite interesting. This is very, very, very interesting. This is static analysis tool. So in other words, here we use is not sonar, but is looking at the most popular code coverage that is NYC, NYC and Istanbul and C8. So let's get into this, shall we? Let's get into this.
C8 and Istanbul, they're mostly, in the same way Vitess and Jest are API compliant with each other, they are mostly all compliant with each other. So like which one you choose doesn't, I don't care, right? I use C8 With the C8 is named after like V8 annotates the code. Why do I use C8? Because that is the one, Vitess will like prompt you to choose either Istanbul or C8. That was first on the list in the dropdown. Right, I'd love to tell you there's a better reasoning about it. But there are some like configuration features, right? You can have all. All is, I think, a super interesting one if you're trying to get that heuristic, because if you think about this, normally what would happen is you do npm run test. Neat. It goes through your test files. It's like basically walking that dependency tree with your import statements, which means files that never get imported never get counted towards code coverage, right? Which is either exactly what you want or you don't want. If you're just glancing, hey, I'm working on test coverage for this file because I think it's important, then you really only want to like point it at a given file. And if you do run like any of the filters, your coverage report is going to be really bogus anyway, because like you might not have the coverage because that test runner didn't do it. All will at least try its best to like truly walk the tree and find everything and like start working through all the files. It's also slower, but it's good if you're trying to get a sense. Then like again, like my test utilities, my tests themselves, I don't want them counting. Like again, to the joke that we've had all day, who tests the test? Not me. TypeScript files, right? Like configuration files. It'll depend on your application. Again, big JSON files that are maybe fixtures for something. Like sometimes, like when I find weird situations, I will grab the network request JSONs and I'll throw them in a directory in case I ever want to like do something with them later, put the UI in weird states. You can choose to ignore a bunch of stuff. You can choose to include a bunch of stuff. I think that this is arguably more important in practicality, because like again, let's say you run this thing and it's like a sea of red, right? You're like, cool. Let me start pushing back the ocean with a broom, right? You might know.
Yeah,
hey,
let me start pushing back the ocean back into the broom. let me start pushing the. Let me start pushing back the ocean with a broom. And I get it why it came here, and I get it why it came here, and I get it why it came here. Yep. Let me push back the ocean with a broom. Okay. Okay. And you can use is the include here. You can say, hey, the include key is important because if not, then you might see a sea of red. A sea of red.
let's say you run this thing and it's like a sea of red, right? You're like, cool. Let me.
You know, you see a sea of red, and it is like, cool. Let me push back the ocean. Let me push back the ocean with a broom.
Let me start pushing back the ocean with a broom, right? You might know, hey,
let me start pushing. Let me start pushing back the ocean with a broom. Let me start pushing. Exactly. Let me start pushing back the ocean.
I know that like the files in this directory, I know that this particular file is like critically important to my application, and it has terrible code coverage, right? You might start with one piece of your application, right? Like we are in this workshop, in this course, we're not going for like the Platonic ideal of anything. We're going from, I have a 10-year-old code base, I inherited something, oh no, oh my God, I like can't sleep at night. What do I do? You might choose the 2 or 3 most critical parts of your app and choose to maybe enforce the code coverage at that point because you know that they're critical, right? We're doing things because they make us feel better and make us more confident, not because we have read a blog post on the internet that told us we should, right? The other one that I think is interesting, which you saw statements, features, branches, you know, choose one of what you think is the most important. Just like and you do that by feel, by glancing the code. Like a lot of this is by feel. I hate to break it to you. And this will actually like fail if you use -- coverage if the threshold drops below that. To which you might be asking, hey Steve, how did you settle on 59.79% code coverage? I would like to draw your attention to line 23, which is threshold auto update, which is I put in the number 50 because I glanced at it and I saw at the time it was
Yeah.
54, but like we've been solving some issues during the workshop and I think I added some stuff last night. And I have threshold auto update set to true, which just basically says it can't go down, right? Like if for some reason we wrote some tests and we got this thing up to 60, guess what it would auto update my file to be? 60, right? You know, like especially if you're being very like nuanced with the include, I don't like as much as I'm against, because it's just like one of those things like if you had it at 100 or something really high, and it was like to your point before, like why was line 15 red? Like I'm sure I could spend an hour and figure it out. I'm sure nobody wants to watch that right now, so I'm gonna say I don't know, move on with my life, right? Like you will turn this off if it gets to the point where it's breaking for arbitrary things. But there might be things like I'm trying to fix this. I'm trying to like we have a problem. I'm solving a problem, and then you might choose to turn that off. You know what I mean? Once you've gotten to the point where you're no longer worried about it, and that is totally fine as well. But Dustin has a question.
What is the all:"true"?
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit. Like, if you don't have that on, it will only check the coverage of the files hit by your test runner, right? Which means, by definition, there will be some files that have 0% test coverage because no test file ever imports them. Because like Vitest is looking for like you can actually,
exclude
it's looking in this case. I have
all of
some
this
weird things in this
file.
one. There's a default exclude that you can see.
So you
but
want
like,
to
for the
include
regular
all
ones, I'm
of
avoiding the
this?
svelte tests.
And then you started to see a
weird stuff
sea
in
of
this
reds. You want to say, hey, let me start
but like it will only,
pushing
like
back
Vitest will
the
load
issue
anything
with a
usually with
broom
like
by
star.test.ts,
excluding each
whatever.
one of them.
And it'll look at those imports and annotate everything. Files that are never imported by a test aren't ever accounted if you have all set to false, which is the default.
And then
So all true, like we'll also
So
do a file
this
system scan,
is-
try to collect them all
so
that would have
C8
matched.
is now API
and then
compliant with
analyze them
Jest,
as well. Which means you
which is
will
great.
get some things that may, like it's tricky because you will then end up with things you never aspire to have test coverage. Like again, like
Result
vitest.config.ts. That is a
sort of
file that I will never test. Right? I don't want to test, I don't care. And I have it in the ignore one. So if you do all, this grows. Right? If you don't have all on, you can probably get rid of this, right? And so it's like, how much pain do you want in what direction? A lot of these things depend on the like unique, like all good code bases have a lot of things in common. All terrible code bases are unique and special in their own way.
Oh my god, you know, so all good code bases has things in common, and all terrible code bases are unique in their own. All code bases are terrible in their unique way. Oh my god.
Things depend on the like unique, like all good code bases have a lot of things in common.
Exactly. All good code bases has a lot of things in common, and all bad. All good code bases have a lot of things in common. All bad code bases are unique and special in their own way.
All terrible code bases are unique and special in their own way. And this is why we're kind of taking a very like wide like philosophical.
And we talk about here in good or bad in terms of maintainability instead of a standard maintainability.
Well,
That's
stands
what
here
we
because
mentioned
like
is here
the
bad or
terrible
good.
code base that you were dealing with, if it was that easy to solve by applying a few things, it would have been fixed by now, right? Like you could have probably just even run something that like like Prettier can handle all the formatting issues. You're left with that like nested, like 6 deep nested conditional. You know what I mean? With 3-4 loops in there, right? Like you have to deal with that one. Prettier will definitely move that semicolon back for you though. And yeah, use the tools appropriately. And so yeah, like we're kind of casting a wide net in that sense. But like I said, I think what could be interesting, and there are services where you could, like I think CodeCov is one, Coveralls, which I like as a name, like will also integrate with your build process and like chart it out over time. And again, to the point we made earlier, the number, that's dangerous. A graph that shows it going down is possibly useful. You know what I mean? Like saying like, we have to have 80. And I think Amazon does this, right? Where it's like a Bezos thing where it can't drop below 90 or something like that.
So, philosophical question about that. I think you already answered, but I want to just clarify. When
Yeah.
you say the 80-20 rule, for example,
Yeah.
you're not saying just look at it. If it says 80%, we're good. You got to actually look at what 80% has been covered.
Yeah, it's like, are you covering the right 80?
Exactly. So, with the threshold, okay? So with the threshold with the code coverage threshold, with the code coverage threshold, right? Like this. So with the code coverage threshold, we are now
clarify. When
Yeah.
you say the 80-20 rule, for example,
Yeah.
you're not saying just look at it if it says 80% we're good.
Exactly. So with the code coverage threshold at 80%, 80-20, for example, or at 80% or 80%, you are not, so you are not saying, hey, we're good. You are not saying we're good. Exactly. So you are not saying, hey, we're good.
You got to actually look at what.
You gotta actually look at, hey, we're good. You gotta actually look at what's being tested. You gotta actually look at. You gotta actually look at what. You gotta actually look at what 80%. At what 80% is being tested or is being covered, because at the end of the day, coverage is all about that. It's what are all. Okay, you have now this metric, this number that tells you is how much of your source code is tested, but you need to look at what is this test. So you need to look at what are you testing? What your tests represent? Are your testing is represent is so if your test represent is user stories, all right? How confident are you to those tests represent those user stories?
It's being covered.
Yeah, it's like, are you
So it could
covering the
be-
right 80%,
The
right?
20% that's not covered could be the most.
Yeah, it could be the 80% of what your code does.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like we joked before about that agony for like performance, right? Like, the like if the like most hit code path in real world production usage is not covered, that's probably more important than like if you had 80% of like files that don't really get used all that often, right? And like also any number that you read on the internet should be treated with suspicion, because there might be a bunch of backend engineers who have like microservices where everything is really like condensed down, and we have to deal with like a bunch of state and like Safari hacks. It used to be IE hacks, right? And like things are tougher over here.
Viewports and
What's that?
viewports and
And
devices.
viewports and like weird like Firefox does this a little bit differently, and macOS wants to put a glowing, that kind of stuff. And like I said, this is only doing what Vitess does. So like you could have an amazing set of like, to the question we got from after lunch, you could have an amazing set of like browser-based tests, and maybe someone's be like, yo, there's a tool that like merges these things. Like I don't know about it because like it's usually working against the built assets at that point. We don't have access to this anymore. But like you could have something that the moderns, I'm like a thing monitoring tool. I do not. Have I worked at companies which won't let you install third-party anything ever, and understand that you might have to given where. Let's talk about if we wanted to generate this as part of our build process and then view this file as a thing to do. And to be clear, you're like, I don't care about code coverage. We're just using this as a vehicle. Like for instance, you might care about like the video recordings that Cypress takes if a test fails, like because there's nothing worse. It's not a Cypress thing. This is just most recently happened to me with Cypress, where you run the test on your machine, and everything is great, and your build keeps failing, right? And so like getting access to the videos or something like that a lot of these tools take is super useful. Mm-hmm. And exactly what we show here works the same way when it comes down to like whatever we're doing. The other thing I'll point out, and this is like slightly different for every different testing tool, whether it's NYC or Istanbul, whatever, there are just like ESLint where you can ignore a line. So for instance, our famous line 15, if I had a threshold and you needed to ignore something like very specifically, like if there's one like only in Safari, which you should not be writing user agent based code, but like I've done bad things in my life, you might choose, because that will never get hit in your CI/CD process on Ubuntu, right? Cool. So luckily, and there are various reasons why you might do what you do. Also like building your static assets, stuff like that. There's all sorts of things you might choose to do here. Luckily, the strategy is exactly the same no matter what you aspire to do. And so there's lots of ways that I could choose to do this. But like...
Yeah, you can define it's not another job there.
like basically, I'll show you how to do this, and then yeah, we want it only on the test one in this case.
Okay.
Which one I could, I could have a separate job. This depends again on how you want to live your life. I could put my dash coverage in here with that auto threshold, right? As I switch branches with example code as I talk, who knows how that will go. But like, let's go with the spiritual just here. Dash coverage now, like, do I want the build to fail? Do I want basically, did my test fail or did I not have enough coverage? That's a reason why you might break that out into its own job, right? Which is I want the visual representation when I see that red X to immediately know. I think that I have sold myself the argument that this should be a second job, even though it's also running the test suite. So there's the thing that I learned about myself today.
So now here we're gonna run is this
which is weird. I
coverage
don't think that's true in my
in
current
a separate
code.
process, so we can actually
and this is,
visualize that. That's
a
the
catastrophe from when I was
main
practicing.
thing.
So we've got the steps, and so we run
And all of these are
npm test, and
running
we do
in
that with
parallel.
dash coverage this time.
Double dash. Double dash.
Yep, thank you. That's why you live code with your friends. Cool, and that will run it, and then we need the important part. And a lot of these are like, you owe it to yourself. I should not do this together with y'all because it's not a good use of like a generalized time. You owe it to yourself to Google GitHub Actions recipes and just like peruse, like do a very cursory overview of the random blog posts.
Cursory
of like, because like
overview.
I work on open source code base, so like triaging Git issues with labels and like having it like hit a Slack webhook, hit me in like is important to me. And if you work on a private code base, completely worthless to you. So we will not be doing that one together. But you owe it to yourself to at least look at it, because a lot of these things, the process is like awareness that you can do it is like half the battle, because you're gonna watch how many characters I type here to get this in
Awareness
place.
of what you're doing. Yeah, okay. Move on, man.
So
move
there's
on.
an action called upload artifact. And my main goal here is that you just understand that artifacts are a thing.
Well,
you want to
artifacts
use this
just are
coding
code
and
that
typing
is
at the
generated
same time.
based on
We'll
output,
call
whether
it
it's
archive
usually logs or
coverage
binary
report.
file, right?
Right. If you
Active
needed the build
coverage
asset
report.
to like then download from the archive API and then push to like your internal, like I used to have like literal Linux boxes in Chicago that I had to like push the production access to, and we would take two of them out of the load balancer because it was way too late for that to still be the thing, but it's not important. So you give it some kind of name, in this case, coverage report. And we say, what path? Like again, if this was like your build output, it would be the build directory or dist or like whatever like scientific experiment you're doing. In this case, I know that the folder is coverage.
Well, that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye-bye.